G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Jeremiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So welcome to session 27. Today we'll be looking from chapter 40, verse 7 down to chapter 42, verse 22. Now, we left off last session. Judah has fallen, Jerusalem has fallen, the exiles have been taken away into Babylon, and poor old Jeremiah, he was walking in the streets in what was left in Jerusalem, and he got he got scooped up by the soldiers, arrested, taken to Ramah, where he's going to be shipped off in chains to Babylon. And he's recognized by Nebuzaradan, the general, who releases him and acknowledges to him that, you know, all this has happened because as a nation you have sinned against your God. And this is what Nebuzaradan said to him. And he said, we have been sent here by your God to do this. But Nebuzaradan also says to Jeremiah, he says, listen, he says, why don't you come to Babylon with me and I will look after you in Babylon? And this is a Gentile looking after the Jewish prophet Jeremiah. So Jeremiah doesn't answer, so Nebuzaradan says, listen, what you can do if you want is you can remain in the land, and Jeremiah does take the choice of remaining in Judah, and he's actually living in Mizpah. And so Nebuzaradan gives him finances and food to help him on his way. And that's where we left off last session. Now, we're coming into this session now, and we're looking at Gedaliah's governorship. Gedaliah was the one appointed by Nebuchadnezzar to oversee Judah. His governorship is summarized in verses 7 to 12 of Jeremiah 40. He was a very good and successful administrator, but it didn't last very long. Verses 7 to 8 report on the submission of various military units to the authority of Gedaliah. Now, this is verse 7. Now, when all the captains of the forces that were in the fields, even they and their men, heard that the king of Babylon had made Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, governor in the land, and had committed unto him men and women and children, and of the poorest of the land, of them that were not carried away captive to Babylon. So, what we see here is that there are certain leaders of Judean military groups who were still in the open country. And they may have engaged in some guerrilla warfare against the Babylonian army attacking its flanks. While their maneuvers were unsuccessful, these soldiers had not been captured by the Babylonians. They were still free. And as soon as they heard that Nebuchadnezzar had appointed Gedaliah over the land and put him in charge of the remaining population, they traveled down to Mizpah to meet with the new governor. Now, among them were 6 commanders whose names are listed in verse 8. Then they came to Gedaliah to Mizpah, to wit, Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, Johanan and Jonathan, the sons of Kareah, and Seraiah, the son of Tanhumeth, and the sons of Ephi, the Netophite, and Jezaniah, the son of the Maccatite, they and their men. So these are the leaders, captains of the forces. So these are the captains of the units. Now, 2 of them are going to be prominent later on. Ishmael ben Nethaniah and Johanan. And we're going to see there's a historic account of these 2 guys found in 2 Kings 25, verse 22 and 23. 2 Kings 25 just gives us the historical account of these 2 men. It says, and as for the people that were left in the land of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had left, even over them he made Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, governor. And when all the captains of the forces, they and their men, heard that the king of Babylon had made Gedaliah governor, they came to Gedaliah to Mizpah, even Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and Johanan, the son of Kareah, and Seraiah, the son of Tanhumeth, Nethophite, and Jezaniah, and their men. Okay, so while the vast majority of Judeans who were permitted to remain in Judah were from the lower classes, there were also some royals. One of them we see here, Ishmael ben Nethaniah. He was from the royal line. and also left behind were multiple soldiers. Now, in verses 9 to 10 is a message of Gedaliah to these captains of these guerrilla military units. And in verse 9 is the offer of clemency if they submit to his authority. And Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, swore unto them and to their men, saying, fear not to serve the Chaldeans. Dwell in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it shall be well with you. So Gedaliah swore an oath to these officers and assured them of clemency if they submitted to his authority. Now, the majority of Babylonian soldiers had retreated to their homeland, with the exception of one military contingent unit that had been placed under Gedaliah's command. All the Judeans who were supposed to be led into exile had been captured, and they were on their way to Babylon. So anyone who was left behind, even military units, were being given this offer of clemency in that they would not be exiled if they submitted to Gedaliah's authority. Gedaliah's message continues in verse 10, who says, as for me, behold, I will dwell at Mizpah to stand before the Chaldeans that shall come unto us. Now, remember, by this time, Jerusalem had been destroyed and could no longer function as the capital. Therefore, Mizpah had been chosen as the new capital. So Gedaliah then assured the Judean officers that he would serve as a mediator between them and the Babylonians in official matters. And as governor of the new Babylonian province of Judea, he would be under the authority of the Babylonian king. However, what he did do was he promised to stand in defense of any Judean soldier when the Babylonians reappeared in the land. And in return, they simply needed to accept Gedaliah as governor and then return and work the land. And the second part of verse 10 is the return to normalcy in the land. But you gather ye wine and summer fruits and oil and put them in your vessels and dwell in your cities that you have taken. So we see here the phrase cities that you have taken. That implies here that these 6 officers, which we saw in the previous passage, did maintain control of several towns throughout the land. Apparently, the Babylonians only concentrated on the destruction of the major cities in Judah and did not bother with some of the smaller towns. So these towns were still intact and you could still live in them. So the officers were to stay in these towns that were under their control. Verses 11 to 12 record the return of many refugees. Likewise, when all the Jews that were in Moab and among the children of Ammon and in Edom, and that were in all the countries, heard that the king of Babylon had left a remnant of Judah, and that he had set over them Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, then all the Jews returned out of all places whither they were driven, and came to the land of Judah to Gedaliah unto Mizpah, and gathered wine and summer fruits very much. So the majority of refugees now returned from these 3 countries located along the Jordan River, Moab, Ammon, and Edom. And these were Jews who had escaped to these countries either before, during, or after the Babylonian War. They also came from nations that were not identified in the account here. And these guys learned that the king of Babylon had left a remnant behind of the Jewish people, meaning that he had not taken the entire Jewish population into captivity. And in addition, they realized that the leader of the land was also a Jew, Gedaliah. So they returned to Judah. They met up with Gedaliah in Mizpah, which is the new capital of Judah. And then they began harvesting the fruit that was still growing, despite the fact that the population of the land had now been drastically reduced. We see the murder of Gedaliah in chapter 40, verse 13, down to chapter 41, verse 3. Now, verses 13 to 16 show the assassination did not come without a warning. Verse 13 identifies the men who warned Gedaliah. Moreover, Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the captains of the forces that were in the fields came to Gedaliah to Mizpah, So the men listed here were mentioned before back in verse 8, with the exception of Ishmael ben Nethaniah. And all these men came to Gedaliah, and Johanan here is specifically referenced because he appears to have been the leader of this group. And the content of the warning is given in verse 14. And said unto him, do you know that Baalis, the king of the children of Ammon, has sent Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, to take your life? This is the warning. So two people were now involved in this conspiracy to kill Gedaliah. One of them was the Ammonite king Baalis, who was a Gentile, and Ishmael ben Nethaniah, a Jew of royal descent. We see that in chapter 40, verse 1. Now, it's unclear here what Baalis's motivations were. He may have simply wished to harass the Babylonians, and one way of doing so would have been to assassinate the governor whom they had appointed. Another possible reason may have been the desire to annex Judah through the removal of its governor when he saw how productive the land was, the fruit of Judah. Now, also as unknown here is why Ishmael would have allowed himself to become involved in the conspiracy. We're going to see a couple of possible reasons shortly. Unfortunately, Gedaliah did not believe the men who warned him of the plot in the second part of verse 14. But Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, believed them not. He didn't believe the report from these men. Now, despite Gedaliah's refusal to trust in his report, Johanan made an effort to the governor, made an offer to the governor that is detailed in verses 15 to 16. Then Johanan, the son of Kareah, spoke to Gedaliah in Mizpah secretly, saying, let me go, I pray you, and I will slay Ishmael the son of Nethaniah, and no man shall know it. Wherefore should he take your life? That all the Jews that are gathered unto you should be scattered, and the remnant of Judah perish. But Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, said unto Johanan, the son of Kareah, you shall not do this thing, for you speak falsely of Ishmael. So Johanan realized that the assassination of the governor of Judah, appointed by Nebuchadnezzar himself, would have disastrous consequences for the Jewish people. And in his eyes, it was better to secretly kill Ishmael than to hinder the survival of Judah. And then in verse 16, Gedaliah refused to believe that there was any such conspiracy. In essence, what he did was he actually accused Johanan of being a liar and speaking falsely concerning Ishmael. Eventually, the conspiracy did come to pass. The murder is detailed in 41 verses 1 to 3. The date here was the 7th month, or the Hebrew month of Tishri. This is equivalent to our month of October. Now, this conspiracy took place only 2 months after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Gedaliah was only able to govern for a 2-month duration, and that's why to this day, Orthodox Jews celebrate the fast of Gedaliah. It's celebrated on the 3rd day of the 7th month. It's also mentioned actually in Zechariah 7 verse 5, Zechariah 7 verse 5, and Zechariah 8 verse 19. Zechariah 8:19. So this comes 2 months after the fast for the fall of Jerusalem. Now, we also know now that the murderer was Ishmael. And the fact that Gedaliah entertained Ishmael so freely with so little protection reveals how little stock he placed by the warning of Johanan. Ishmael was the son of Nethaniah. He was a grandson of Elishama. And if this was the same Elishama of 1 Chronicles 3 verse 8 and 1 Chronicles 14:7, this was the Elishama who was the son of King David. So in this case, the term would not refer to an immediate grandson, but to an ancestor of King David. Now, verse 1 also goes on to say that Ishmael was a member of the royal seed, or the seed royal, meaning that he was a member of the royal house. And because of this added statement, it seems to be very clear that this Elishama was the son of David. This would mean that Ishmael was a descendant of King David through Elishama. And so, being a member of the royal house, he would, of course, consider it to be spiteful for someone like Gedaliah, whose family was a servant of the royal house, now to become the governor. So he probably didn't like that fact. And therefore, Ishmael, a member of the royal house of David, refused to be in submission to Gedaliah, who was not a member of the house of David. He was probably willing to join this conspiracy out of jealousy and animosity towards someone who was not a member of the royal house. Now, Ishmael and the 10 men with him ate bread with Gedaliah in Mizpah. Now, Ishmael was guilty of violating Middle Eastern rules of hospitality, because a person would not conspire to kill his host over a meal. Eating together was a sign of friendship and fellowship, and therefore now what is happening in this situation was now an extreme violation of Eastern rules of hospitality. Now we see some other, did I miss a slide? Okay, so verse 2, just make sure, yeah, okay. Verse 2 describes the assassination. Then arose Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and the 10 men that were with him, and smote Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, with the sword, and slew him, whom the king of Babylon had made governor over the land. And verse 3 goes on to show that Gedaliah was not the only one who was murdered at this time. Ishmael also slew all the Jews that were with him, to wit, with Gedaliah at Mizpah, and the Chaldeans that were found there, the men of war. So he killed more than a few people. These atrocities were recorded, committed by Ishmael, were recorded in verse 4. It gives us a time reference here. It came to pass the second day after he had slain Gedaliah, and no man knew it. So during this time, the news had not yet gotten out that Gedaliah had been killed. And Ishmael also killed everyone else in the house, so it was still a well-kept secret. So he didn't just kill Gedaliah, he killed everybody else in the house. Verse 5 is the occasion for these other atrocities. That there came men from Shechem, from Shiloh, and from Samaria, even 80 men, having their beards shaven and their clothes rent, and having cut themselves, with meal offerings and frankincense in their hand, to bring them to the house of Jehovah. So 80 different Jewish men were heading to Jerusalem with offerings. Now, remember, the temple was destroyed. And the cities they came from were Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria. Now, what's the significance about these cities? Well, these 3 cities, all of them were former centers of idolatry in the northern kingdom of Israel. So these men have come from these cities, but now these guys who are coming down now, these were the ones who had been left behind from the Assyrian captivity. They were coming down to Jerusalem to bring offerings to Jehovah. These were pious Jews who were left from the Assyrian captivity of northern Israel. Now, they were in mourning for the destruction of the temple, and their signs of mourning included the fact that their beards were shaven, and this was only done in periods of mourning and extreme distress. A man would not normally shave his beard. And their clothing was torn, and they had cut themselves. Now, the shaving of the beard and the tearing of the clothing, these were proper signs of mourning according to Mosaic law, while cutting themselves was considered proper among the pagans. This was actually in direct violation of Mosaic law in Leviticus 19, verse 28, and chapter 21, verse 5 in Leviticus, and also Deuteronomy 14:1. So they were actually violating the Mosaic law when they actually cut themselves. So these shaven and cut men in torn clothing brought offerings of grain and frankincense to the temple. And since the events occurred in Tishri, these offerings were meant for the festivals of the 7th month, meaning for the feasts of trumpets, Yom Kippur or Day of Atonement, and Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. So as these men were traveling toward Jerusalem, they'd have been on the main mountain road, and Ishmael would have seen them clearly as they passed the town of Mizpah. So verse 6 now describes Ishmael's reaction or his deception. And Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, went forth from Mizpah to meet them, weeping all along as he went. And it came to pass, as he met them, he said unto them, Come to Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam. So Ishmael left Mizpah, where he killed Gedaliah, to meet these pilgrims. When he got to them, he pretended to be in mourning over Jerusalem as well. And then he invited them to enter Mizpah and meet Gedaliah, the governor. And these poor men falling for the deceit, these guys from Shechem, Shiloh, and Samaria, they now entered into Mizpah. And verse 7 describes their assassination. And it was so when they came into the midst of the city that Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, slew them and cast them into the midst of the pit, he and the men that were with him. The Hebrew term here for pit, which is bor, means a cistern. So we see 70 of the 80 pilgrims were killed, and their bodies were now thrown into a cistern. No reason is given as to why Ishmael murdered all of these people. And one begins to picture Ishmael as a brutal murderer who enjoyed killing for its own sake, because there was no reason to kill these men. However, what we'll see a little bit later on, Ishmael was actually driven by materialistic greed. In verse 8, 10 of these men saved themselves. But 10 men were found among them that said unto Ishmael, Slay us not, for we have stores hidden in the field of wheat and of barley and of oil and of honey. So he forbore and slew them not among their brethren. So these 10 escaped. They pleaded with Ishmael not to kill him in order to save themselves. The men offered valuable supplies of food. They had hidden these 4 items in the fields, hidden them from the Babylonian armies, wheat, barley, oil, and honey. So these were things which Ishmael could use. So he had held off from killing them at this time. Verse 9 describes a cistern where Gedaliah, his men, the Babylonian soldiers, and there also these 70 men from Israel were buried. Now the pit wherein Ishmael cast all the dead bodies of the men whom he had slain by the side of Gedaliah, the same was that which Asa the king had made for fear of Baasha, king of Israel. So Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, filled it with them that were slain. So this cistern had the Babylonian army unit that was on the Gedaliah. It had Gedaliah and all the Jews who were in the house with him, and it had these 70 Jewish pilgrims. And this cistern was built by King Asa. 1 Kings 15, 16 to 22 talks about Asa. He built a fortress at Mizpah 300 years earlier, using material that he stole from the fortress of Baasha at Ramah. And he did so when he feared a siege by this king of Israel. Okay, and that king, Baasha, king of Israel. Now, according to 2 Chronicles 16, verses 1 to 6, 2 Chronicles 16, 1 to 6, there were numerous conflicts between Asa and Baasha. And so it was this cistern that Asa had built that Ishmael now filled with corpses of his victims. And then verse 10 describes the next step of Ishmael's evil scheme. Then Ishmael carried away captive all the residue of the people that were in Mizpah, even the king's daughters, and all the people that remain in Mizpah, whom Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, had committed to Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam. Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, carried them away captive and departed to go over to the children of Ammon. That's across the other side of the Jordan. He must have realized, Ishmael must have realized that he could not keep Gedaliah's assassination a secret forever. And therefore, what he did was he captured everyone who was still in Mizpah, including the king's daughters, and although not mentioned by name, Jeremiah and his scribe Baruch, because that's where they were living in Mizpah. Apparently, he intended to take these captives to the Ammonite king Baalis. In all probability, they were to serve as slaves to the Ammonites. There was no personal benefit for Ishmael in delivering these Jewish captives to the Ammonites unless he was going to be compensated for them. So this, and the fact that Ishmael had kept the 10 pilgrims alive so that he could get the spoils that they had, shows that he was driven more by materialistic greed. We're going to see the rescue of the remnant in chapter 41, verses 11 to 18. So now the people at Mizpah were in great danger of being abducted and handed over to the Ammonites. But help now comes in verses 11 to 18. So they've escaped from the Babylonian armies. They've left them in the land, and now Jews are now going to abduct them and take them across to Ammon. Now, verse 11 now identifies the rescuers. But when Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the captains of the forces that were with him heard of all the evil that Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, had done. So back in chapter 40, verse 13, remember, Johanan had warned Gedaliah of Israel's conspiracy, but Gedaliah didn't believe him. So when he and the commanders of the forces that were with him heard of the atrocities that had now been committed by Ishmael, they set out to chase after him. They're going to get him and deal with him. The key rescuer here is Johanan, the son of Kareah. He became the leading figure among the other captains of the forces who were involved in this rescue. He had warned Gedaliah back in chapter 40:13 of the conspiracy against him, and he had offered to kill Ishmael. The other captains were apparently under his command, and they joined him and set out to chase after the killer when they heard of all the evil of Ishmael. Verse 12 describes the pursuit. Then they took all the men and went to fight with Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, and found him by the great waters that are in Gibeon. So Johanan caught up with Ishmael by the pool of Gibeon. Pool of Gibeon, you can find that in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 to 16. 2 Samuel 2, 12 to 16. The town of Gibeon was located due south of Mizpah and southwest of Ramah. Ramah, remember, was a staging area for all the captives to be heading off into Babylon. At any rate, apparently they went due south first to Gibeon. This is from Mizpah. Perhaps that we're going to spend the first night in Gibeon, and then they probably planned to turn east from there towards the Ammonites. So from Gibeon, that would not be a very difficult trip because it's just across the river. It would take 1 or 2 days at most. But Johanan and his men caught up with Ishmael and his men. And this same pool of Gibeon we see in 2 Samuel 2. It relates to the story of certain events in the days of King David at this pool. Verses 13 to 14 describe the escape of Ishmael's captives. In verse 13, we learn that the remnant taken captive by Ishmael escaped and were glad when they saw the captains of the forces. Now it came to, verse 13, now it came to pass that when all the people that were with Ishmael saw Johanan, the son of Kareah, and all the captains of the forces that were with him, then they were glad. So all the people that Ishmael had carried away captive from Mizpah turned about and came back and went unto Johanan, the son of Kareah. In verse 14, they turned round and they ran from the camp of Ishmael to the camp of Johanan. And when the people saw that the soldiers under Ishmael would have their hands full with their attackers, they fled. Ishmael had no choice but to allow the refugees to escape to Johanan. And then in verse 15, Ishmael managed to flee. But Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, escaped from Johanan with 8 men and went to the children of Ammon. It's not clear whether if the rest of Ishmael's men were lost in the battle, but only he and 8 of his soldiers were able to cross the Jordan River and then escape to Ammon. And from a biblical perspective, they were never heard of again. Their part in the story is finished. Now, what to do with this remnant that Johanan has now inherited? Verses 16 to 18, they now moved from Gibeon, where they were rescued, further south. They did not return north to Mizpah, but they went south past a ruined Jerusalem to a town called Geruth Shimham. According to verse 16, they were gathered by Johanan and his men. Then took Johanan the son of Kareah and all the captains of the forces that were with him, all the remnant of the people whom he had recovered from Ishmael the son of Nethaniah from Mizpah. After that he had slain Gedaliah the son of Ahikam, to wit, the men of war and the women and the children and the eunuchs whom he had brought back from Gibeon. So 4 categories of people were rescued by Johanan and his men. Men of war, meaning the soldiers who at that time had no weapons, the women, the children, and the eunuchs. The eunuchs probably referring to government officials who were in charge of the daughters of the king, which mentioned back in verse 10, as part of Ishmael's captives. Johanan gathered all these people in Gibeon. And in verse 17, the escapees are described as making camp, and they departed and dwelled in Geruth Shimham, which is by Bethlehem, to go to enter into Egypt. So Geruth Shimham means dwelling place of Shimham. It may refer to a place mentioned in 2 Samuel 19, 37 to 38, not quite sure. If so, it was what is called a caravanserai that allowed travelers and their animals to stay overnight. Its location was near Bethlehem, a fact that reveals a couple of things to us here. First, from Gibeon, Mizpah was due north. Bethlehem was due south. So rather than moving back home by moving north, these travelers were now moving south, going past the ruined city of Jerusalem. So where are they headed? Second, they had already passed Jerusalem, so the people were now on the road to Egypt. They'd made up their minds to flee to the neighboring country instead of staying in Judah. In fact, the last phrase more or less admits that fact. They went to go to enter into Egypt. So their idea of going to Egypt was already firmly fixed. What happens in the next chapter is nothing more than a smokescreen for a decision that they had already made. Verse 18 now provides a reason for this decision. Because of the Chaldeans, for they were afraid of them, because Ishmael, the son of Nethaniah, had slain Gedaliah, the son of Ahikam, whom the king of Babylon made governor over the land. So the people now were afraid that when the news of Gedaliah's assassination and the murder of the Babylonian garrison reached Nebuchadnezzar, it could bring on another invasion, another slaughter, resulting in the remaining population now being taken into captivity into Babylon as well. So that's what they feared. And so we're going to see the flight to Egypt, that this is going to go from chapter 42, verse 1 down to chapter 43, verse 7. First part we're going to look at is 42, 1 to 6. This reveals that Jeremiah the prophet was consulted regarding the people's plans to flee to Egypt. And then the second part, 42, 7 to 22, provides God's answer. And the third part is verses 1 to 7, chapter 43. It showed that the people rejected Jeremiah's message. Okay, flight to Egypt. We're going to see Jeremiah now being consulted. Verses 1 to 6 show that the people consulted Jeremiah regarding their plans to escape to Egypt. However, as we're going to see, this request for a consultation was simply a smokescreen, because they had already decided that they're going to flee to Egypt. Verses 1 to 3 deal with inquiry itself. Verse 1 identifying those who made it. Then all the captains of the forces, and Johanan the son of Kareah, and Jezaniah the son of Hashaiah, and all the people from the least even unto the greatest came near. So all the commanders of the Judean forces came to Jeremiah, but two of them are named in particular. We have Johanan and Jezaniah. The fact that Johanan is mentioned first shows that he was still considered the leading captain of the forces. The next one under him was Jezaniah ben Hoshea, who is also mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 8, and chapter 43, verse 2. So while these two men were the leaders of those who approached Jeremiah and asked him for advice, they were accompanied by all the people, from the poorest to the remaining commanders. And in verse 2, we have the request itself. And they said unto Jeremiah the prophet, let we pray you, our supplication be presented before you, and pray for us unto Jehovah your God, even for all this remnant. For we are left but a few of many, as your eyes do behold us. So the people came to Jeremiah with a specific request, namely that he should pray for them and on behalf of the remaining Jews. So verse 3 now gives the purpose of their request. That Jehovah your God may show us the way wherein we should walk and the thing that we should do. So for the first time in his life now, Jeremiah received some recognition of his prophetic role from his own people. Many of his predictions had now come true at this point, and the people wanted to know whether they should stay in Judah or go to Egypt. Now, while they claimed that they would do whatever God wanted of them, in reality, they had already made up their minds to go to Egypt, and they were simply assuming that this would be Jeremiah's message to them. Now, in verse 4, Jeremiah accepted their offer. And Jeremiah the prophet said unto them, I have heard you. Behold, I will pray unto Jehovah your God, according to your words. And it shall come to pass that whatsoever thing Jehovah shall answer you, I will declare it unto you. I will keep nothing back from you. So Jeremiah was very willing to inquire of God's will. However, he warned them in no uncertain terms that he would declare only what God declared. They may not like it, but whatever God declares, that is what he will declare. And then in verses 5 to 6, the people made a commitment to abide by whatever Jeremiah would say. And then they said to Jeremiah, Jehovah be a true and faithful witness amongst us, if we do not according to all the word wherewith Jehovah your God shall send you to us. So they committed themselves to do exactly what the word of God declared to Jeremiah. However, at this point, they were expecting only one answer, and that is, you can go to Egypt. But then in verse 6, they went one step further. Not only did they commit themselves to respond according to the words of God through Jeremiah, but they also promised to obey. Whether it be, this is verse 6, this is the people speaking, whether it be good or whether it be evil, we will obey the voice of Jehovah our God, to whom we send you, that it may be well with us when we obey the voice of Jehovah our God. So they now committed themselves to fulfill whatever he said from the word of God, whether it was good or bad. But their promise was false, because they had already decided to go into Egypt and were certain that God was going to sanction their decision. And they were willing to make this promise in light of what they believed would come to pass. And we see God's answer in verses 7 to 22. Now, we already know that this answer is not going to be to their liking. In verse 7, it came to pass after 10 days that the word of Jehovah came unto Jeremiah. First of all, when God answered Jeremiah's request, we had a 10-day waiting period, and God did not respond immediately, but made the people wait 10 full days. In essence, the message was that they should not go down to Egypt. Verses 8 to 9 is a summons of the people. Then called he Johanan the son of Kareah, and all the captains of the forces that were with him, and all the people, from the least even to the greatest, and said unto them, Thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, unto whom you sent me to present your supplication before him. So the recipients of these summons in verse 8 included Johanan, the son of Kareah, all the captains of the forces, and all the people from the least to the greatest. So he's called them all together. The same ones who came to him in verses 1 to 3 are now summoned in verses 8 to 9. And then in verse 9, Jeremiah said that what he was about to speak was the word of Jehovah and not his own prophecies. Thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel. So this is the message from God of Israel. It's a message to the people who sent Jeremiah to inquire of God himself. And in verse 10, the message begins. In verses 10 to 12 will be the blessings for obedience. The point of obedience is for them to stay in the land. If they stay in the land under the Babylonian authority to which God had appointed that all should be subject, certain blessings will follow. First, in verse 10, if you will still abide in this land, then will I build you and not pull you down, and I will plant you and not pluck you up. For I repent me of the evil that I have done unto you. So what he's saying here is that there will be prosperity in the land. God will build them up and not tear them down. He'll not pluck them up again. The reason is, for I repent of the calamity that I have done unto you. Hebrew term for repent here means nakam, N-A-C-H-A-M, means to be sorry or to console oneself, and it carries the meaning of grieving. So God has been grieving over the calamities that he had to inflict on his people as a result of their sins. So the reason for these blessings was that the judgment that had already fallen upon Judah had satisfied his divine justice, and Jehovah would turn destruction into growth and prosperity if the people obeyed his command. Now, why did they get into trouble in the first place? Because they did not obey him. In verse 11, God further promised that there would be no need to fear the Babylonians. Be not afraid of the king of Babylon, of whom you are afraid. Be not afraid of him, says Jehovah, for I am with you to save you and to deliver you from his hand. So they should not fear the king of Babylon because God is with them. God commits himself to protect them if they remain in the land. Now, when Nebuchadnezzar hears word that Gedaliah, his appointed governor, has been executed and that his own soldiers have been massacred, God will still work in such a way that Nebuchadnezzar will not execute vengeance upon those who are left. And then in verse 12, and I will grant you mercy that he may have mercy upon you and cause you to return to your land. So what God is saying is, he says, you'll be recipients of my mercy. They'll receive divine mercy. And the results of divine mercy will include human mercy, because the king of Babylon will have mercy upon them. So God will fix it in such a way that the recipients of divine mercy will automatically become the recipients of human mercy. He will allow the remnant to settle, plant, and return to their own land. And the he that we see here is that where it says that he may have mercy, this refers to Nebuchadnezzar. The promise here is that the Babylonian king would have compassion on the people of Judah and restore them to their land, to their own land. In verses 13 to 17, he now deals with the other side of the coin. So he says, if you obey me, stay in the land, this is what you're going to have. The flip side is, if you don't obey me, well, you're going to have cursings. Just as there are blessings for obedience, so there will be cursing for disobedience, should they defy God and proceed into the land of Egypt. In verses 13 to 14, he deals with the disobedience factor. Passage begins in verse 13 with a description of passive disobedience. But if you say, we will not dwell in this land, so that you obey not the voice of Jehovah your God. So here we have passive disobedience. One does not break a specific divine law, but one simply refuses to do that which God has commanded. This type of sin we see in verse 13 here. In verse 14, there we now have active disobedience, whereby they actively do that which God told them not to do by saying, no, but we will go into the land of Egypt, where we shall see no war, nor hear the sound of the trumpet, nor have hunger of bread, and there will we dwell. So active disobedience now means that a person does exactly what God has told him or her not to do. And the verse now warns Jeremiah's audience against going to Egypt. Their reason for actively disobeying the Lord was understood. They thought that Egypt was a land where they would be able to live in peace, free of any further war, famines, and death. However, their reasoning was wrong. God warns them with a curse for their active disobedience in verses 15 to 17. In verse 15, the curse will come as a result of disobedience. The curse will find them in Egypt if they disobey. Now therefore, this is verse 15. Now therefore, hear you the word of Jehovah, O remnant of Judah. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, if you indeed set your faces to enter into Egypt and go to sojourn there. In verse 16, what they fear in Judah shall now come upon them in Egypt. Then it shall come, this is verse 16, then it shall come to pass that the sword which you fear shall overtake you there in the land of Egypt, and the famine whereof you are afraid shall follow hard after you there in Egypt, and there you shall die. So if the people fled to Egypt, they would not be freed from the sword, famine, and disease which they feared. The very things I hoped to escape by going to Egypt will now come upon them there, with the result that they would all perish on foreign soil. And then in verse 17, so shall it be with all the men that set their faces to go into Egypt to sojourn there. They shall die by the sword, by the famine, by the pestilence. And none of them shall escape, none of them shall remain or escape from the evil that I will bring upon them. So the recipients of this judgment will be all those who move from passive disobedience to active disobedience by going into Egypt. And the means of death will be the famous triad of Jeremiah: sword, famine, pestilence. None of those that remain in the land of Judah who proceed into the land of Egypt will escape this death. Ultimately, they're all going to die by one of those three causes: sword, famine, or pestilence. Then in verses 18 to 22, we see the people's hypocrisy. The message of Jeremiah from God to the people has first spelled out the blessings which they'll receive for obedience, and then the curses for disobedience. Jeremiah now moves on to explain that this entire act of consultation was just an act of hypocrisy. The people had no intention of keeping God's commands unless they were in keeping with their own desires. That's the point of verses 18 to 22. In verse 18, what happened in Judah will also take place in Egypt. For thus says Jehovah of hosts, the God of Israel, as my anger and my wrath have been poured forth upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so shall my wrath be poured forth upon you when you shall enter into Egypt. You shall be an execration and an astonishment and a curse and a reproach, and you shall see this place no more. So as God's wrath was poured out upon the inhabitants of Judah, so his wrath will also be poured out upon them when they enter into Egypt. And this is going to result in them becoming four things. First, an execration or a curse. There'll be an object of cursing by other peoples. Second, an astonishment, meaning a waste or a horror. And then a curse, meaning that it would become the object of a curse. And then a reproach, meaning that they'd also become the subject of a curse. So they shall see the land of Judah no more. They enter into Egypt. And in verse 19, he now reiterates the original command. Jehovah has spoken concerning you, O remnant of Judah. Go ye not into Egypt. Know certainly that I have testified unto you this day. God could not have proclaimed the prohibition against fleeing to Egypt more authoritatively. This is a solemn command, and there is no doubt about it. Therefore, no one had an excuse for disobeying his command to stay in Judah. The point of God's testimony was that they should not enter into Egypt. Do not go to Egypt. And in verses 20 to 22, he deals with the deceitfulness of the people. Verse 20 gives the deceit itself. For you have dealt deceitfully against your own souls, For you sent me unto Jehovah your God, saying, pray for us unto Jehovah our God. And according unto all that Jehovah our God shall say, so declare unto us, and we will do it. It says, for you have dealt deceitfully against your own souls. The phrasing of the Hebrew could mean you are leading astray at the cost of your own lives. That's what it can mean in Hebrew. They deceived themselves into believing that Jehovah would approve of their plan to flee to Egypt. Their acts of disobedience, however, would cost them their lives. And in their deceit, they had sent Jeremiah to Jehovah, feigning sincere interest in what he would instruct them to do. Oh, we will do everything he tells us to do. They were so confident. They were so confident that the answer would align with their own plans that they vowed to carry out everything that Jehovah told the prophet. However, the truth in verse 21, and I have this day declared it to you, but you have not obeyed the voice of Jehovah your God in anything for which he has sent me unto you. The people now realized that their plan to go to Egypt would never receive the divine sanction they most certainly thought it would. And the section ends with one final warning in verse 22. Now therefore, know certainly that you shall die by the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence, in the place whither you desire to go to sojourn there. So what we're saying here is that the people who are going to enter into Egypt at this time would perish in Egypt from the very same calamities they believed would befall them if they stayed in their homeland in Judah. But in actual fact, it followed them into Egypt. And that's where we will leave it for this session. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.